My parents abandoned me at a rest area on Interstate 40 in the middle of a thunderstorm when I was 16 years old. They didn't leave me because I was a bad kid. They didn't leave me because I'd done something terrible. They left me because I told the truth. Because I refused to lie for them one more time. Because I embarrassed them in front of family by exposing the reality of our life together. So they opened the car door, threw $5 at me, and drove away into the rain, leaving me alone in the darkness with nothing but the clothes on my back. I stood there in shock, watching their taillights disappear, and I realized something that would define the rest of my life. I was completely on my own. But before sunrise, I made one decision. One single choice that would change everything. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I didn't beg strangers for help. I did something my parents never expected. Something that would eventually destroy them in the most public and devastating way possible. I started writing. I documented everything. Every word they said, every detail of the abandonment, every moment of that terrible night. And 12 years later, that documentation became the evidence that brought them to justice, that exposed them to the world, that made sure everyone knew exactly what kind of people they really were. My name is Harper. And this is the story of how one night of abandonment became the most calculated revenge you've ever heard. Let me take you back to October 19th, 2012. I was 16 years old, sitting in the back seat of my parents' Honda Accord, driving back from Memphis to Nashville after a family gathering at my grandparents' house. It should have been a normal 4-hour drive. It should have been uneventful. But nothing in my family was ever normal, and that night would prove it in the worst way possible. My parents, Michael and Diane Harper, were furious with me. Absolutely seething. The tension in the car was so thick I could barely breathe. They hadn't spoken a word to me since we'd left my grandparents' house 2 hours earlier, but I could feel their anger radiating from the front seat like heat from a furnace. What had I done to make them so angry? I'd told the truth. My grandmother had asked me, in front of the whole family, why my grades had dropped so dramatically in the past year. I'd been a straight-A student my entire life, but suddenly I was barely passing most of my classes. She was worried about me, genuinely concerned. And I was so tired of lying. So tired of covering for my parents. So tired of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. So I told her the truth. I told her that I was failing because I was exhausted. Because my parents made me work at their accounting firm every day after school, doing administrative work, filing, data entry, answering phones. Hours and hours of work, unpaid, mandatory. They called it contributing to the family, but it was exploitation. I had no time for homework, no time for studying, no time for anything except work and school. I told my grandmother that I'd begged my parents to let me quit, to let me focus on my education, but they'd refused. They needed the free labor. They needed me to keep their struggling business afloat. The look on my grandmother's face when I said this, the shock and disappointment, that's what my parents couldn't forgive. I'd embarrassed them. I'd exposed their secret. I'd made them look bad in front of family. And now, driving through the rain on a dark highway, I was going to pay for it. My father suddenly swerved off the interstate without warning. I looked up, confused, and saw we were pulling into a rest area. It was nearly 11 at night, raining hard, and the rest area was almost completely deserted. Just a few semi-trucks parked in the far corner and one other car. Why are we stopping? I asked. My father didn't answer. He just pulled into a parking spot near the bathrooms and put the car in park. Get out, he said. His voice was cold, flat, emotionless. What? I thought I'd misheard him. I said get out of the car, Harper. Dad, it's pouring rain. What are you talking about? My mother turned around in her seat, and the look on her face made my blood run cold. Pure hatred. You want to embarrass us? You want to tell everyone our private business? You want to make us look like bad parents? Fine. Let's see how you do on your own. What are you saying? My heart was starting to pound. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. We're saying you're not our problem anymore, my father said. You're 16. You think you're so smart, so independent. You can figure it out yourself. You're kicking me out? Here. At a rest area in the middle of nowhere. My voice was rising, panic setting in. You can't just leave me here. Watch us, my mother said. She reached into her purse, pulled out a $5 bill, and threw it at me. It landed on my lap. There. Now you can't say we left you with nothing. I stared at the money, then at my parents, unable to process what was happening. This had to be a scare tactic. They were trying to teach me a lesson. They'd let me sit in the rain for a few minutes. Then they'd let me back in the car. They wouldn't actually abandon me. Get out now or I'll drag you out, my father said, and something in his tone told me he meant it. With shaking hands, I opened the car door. The rain immediately soaked me, cold and relentless. I stepped out onto the wet pavement, still holding the $5 bill, still thinking this couldn't be real. My mother leaned over and pulled my door shut. Through the window, I could see her face, hard and unforgiving. Maybe this will teach you to keep your mouth shut, she said. And then my father hit the gas. I watched, frozen in disbelief, as they drove away. I watched their taillights get smaller and smaller. I watched them merge back onto the interstate. I watched them disappear into the rain and darkness. And then I was alone. I stood there in the rain for I don't know how long, completely unable to move, unable to think, unable to process what had just happened. My parents had actually left me. They'd actually abandoned me at a rest area in the middle of the night, in the rain, with $5 and nothing else. No phone. They controlled my cell phone and had taken it with them. No bag, no clothes, no identification except my school ID card in my pocket. No way to contact anyone. No way to get help. Nothing. The rain was coming down hard, soaking through my clothes, plastering my hair to my face. I was shivering, but I couldn't tell if it was from cold or shock. Probably both. Finally, my body started working again, and I ran to the small covered area near the bathrooms. It wasn't much shelter, just a concrete overhang, but at least I was out of the direct rain. I sat down on the cold concrete bench, hugging myself, trying to stop shaking. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. Parents didn't just abandon their children at rest areas. This was something you heard about on the news, something that happened to other people, not to me. But it was happening. It was real. And I was completely, utterly alone. I looked around the rest area. There were a few semi-trucks parked in the truck section, their engines running, drivers probably sleeping inside. There was one car parked near mine, but I couldn't see anyone in it. The rest area was lit by harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look surreal and nightmarish. I had $5. That was it. That was all I had in the entire world. What could I even do with $5? I couldn't call anyone because I didn't have a phone. I couldn't go anywhere because I was in the middle of nowhere, miles from any town. I couldn't even buy food because $5 wouldn't get me much, and I'd need to save it for something more important, though I didn't know what. The panic started to set in then, real panic, the kind that makes your chest tight and your breathing shallow. I was 16 years old, abandoned, alone, with no resources and no plan. What was I supposed to do? How was I supposed to survive this? I thought about going to one of the truck drivers and asking for help. But I was terrified. I'd heard stories about what could happen to young girls who trusted the wrong people. What if I asked for help and ended up in an even worse situation? I thought about walking to the interstate and trying to hitchhike. But that seemed even more dangerous. And besides, where would I even go? I didn't know anyone in Tennessee except my grandparents, and they lived 2 hours back in Memphis. Even if I could get there, what would I tell them? That their son had abandoned me? Would they even believe me? I sat there for hours, shivering and scared, watching the rain, trying to figure out what to do. And slowly, as the shock began to wear off, something else started to take its place. Anger. Cold, hard, focused anger. My parents had done this. They'd thrown me away like garbage because I'd told the truth. They'd left me here to punish me for embarrassing them. They'd chosen their reputation over their daughter's safety. And they probably thought I'd come crawling back, apologizing, begging them to take me home. They probably thought this would break me, would teach me to be obedient and quiet and compliant. But as I sat there in the cold, watching the rain, I made a decision. I wasn't going to break. I wasn't going to crawl back. I was going to survive this. And I was going to make sure the world knew exactly what they'd done. I'd always been good at writing. It was my best subject in school, the one thing I was naturally talented at. I kept journals, wrote stories, documented everything. And sitting there at 3 in the morning, soaking wet and abandoned, I realized that writing was my weapon. If I documented everything, if I kept a detailed record of what was happening, then someday, somehow, I could use that documentation to hold my parents accountable. I could prove what they'd done. I could make sure they faced consequences. I stood up, my legs stiff from sitting in the cold, and walked over to the vending machine area. There was a small machine that sold random items, travel necessities. I looked through the options with my $5 in hand. I could buy food. I could buy a cheap pair of socks or a travel toothbrush. Or I could buy the one thing that mattered most, a small notebook and pen, packaged together for $4.50. I bought the notebook and pen. I kept the remaining 50 cents. And I went back to my concrete bench and started writing. I wrote the date, October 19th, 2012. I wrote the time, approximately 11:15 p.m. I wrote the location, Interstate 40, rest area mile marker 152, Tennessee. And then I wrote everything. I wrote about the family gathering, about my grandmother's question, about telling the truth. I wrote every word my parents had said in the car. I wrote about the moment they told me to get out, about my mother throwing the $5 at me, about watching them drive away. I wrote about the rain, the cold, the fear. I wrote about being alone. I described everything in as much detail as I could remember, because some instinct told me that details mattered, that specificity mattered, that if I was going to use this documentation someday, it needed to be thorough and accurate and undeniable. I wrote for hours. My hand cramped, my fingers went numb from the cold, but I kept writing. And as I wrote, something strange happened. The act of documenting, of putting words on paper, of creating a record of this nightmare, it gave me a sense of control. I couldn't control what my parents had done. I couldn't control being abandoned. But I could control the story. I could make sure the truth was preserved. By the time the sun started to rise, I'd filled 10 pages of the small notebook with tiny, cramped handwriting. My clothes were still damp, I was exhausted and hungry and cold, but I had something I didn't have before, a purpose, a plan. I was going to survive this night, and every night after. And I was going to document all of it. As the sky lightened, the rest area started to get busier. More cars pulled in, people heading to the bathrooms, getting coffee from the vending machines, stretching their legs before continuing their journeys. I watched them, these normal people living normal lives, and I wondered if any of them could tell just by looking at me that I'd been abandoned here, that I'd spent the night alone in the rain, that I had nowhere to go and no one to help me. Around 6 in the morning, a truck driver approached me. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with kind eyes and a concerned expression. "Hey there," he said gently. "You okay? You've been sitting here for a while." I looked up at him, and I made a quick decision. I needed help. I couldn't survive on my own with 50 cents and a notebook. I had to trust someone. "I need help," I said, and my voice came out hoarse from not speaking for hours. "My parents left me here last night. They abandoned me. I don't have a phone or money or any way to get anywhere. I don't know what to do." His expression changed from concern to shock. "They left you here? Last night? In that storm?" I nodded. "I'm 16. They just drove away and left me." He pulled out his phone immediately. "Okay, we're calling the police. This is child abandonment. This is illegal. You're going to be okay, but we need to get you help right now." Part of me wanted to say no, wanted to refuse, because involving the police meant involving the system, meant foster care and social services and all the things I'd heard horror stories about. But I was cold and hungry and exhausted, and I didn't have any better options. The truck driver, whose name was Bill, stayed with me while we waited for the police. He bought me hot chocolate and a breakfast sandwich from the vending machines. He gave me his jacket because I was shivering. He treated me with more kindness in 30 minutes than my parents had shown me in years. When the police arrived, I told them everything. I showed them my notebook, the documentation I'd started. They took photos of me, of the rest area, of everything. They called Child Protective Services. And just like that, I entered the system. The social worker who came to get me was a tired-looking woman named Ms. Patterson. She drove me to a temporary foster home in Nashville, asking questions the whole way. Where did my parents live? Did I have other family? Had they ever done anything like this before? I answered as best I could, but mostly I was numb. The foster home was okay. Not great, not terrible, just okay. A couple in their 40s who took in emergency placements. They gave me clean clothes, a bed, food. They were kind but distant, professional. I was just another kid passing through their house. Over the next few days, CPS tried to contact my parents. They called their home number, their cell phones, went to their house. My parents didn't answer. They were avoiding the authorities, probably hoping the whole thing would just go away. But it didn't go away. After a week of no contact, CPS filed charges. Child abandonment, child endangerment, neglect. My parents were officially wanted for questioning. And suddenly, they decided to respond. They showed up at the CPS office with a lawyer, claiming that I'd run away, that they'd been searching for me frantically, that I was lying about being abandoned. They said I was a troubled teen, that I'd been acting out, that I'd jumped out of the car during an argument and they'd been unable to find me in the dark and rain. It was a complete fabrication, and I was terrified that people would believe them. But I had my notebook. I had my documentation, written in real time, with specific details that couldn't be fabricated after the fact. I had the testimony of Bill, the truck driver, who'd found me at 6 in the morning and could confirm I'd been there for hours. I had the police report, the photos, the timeline. My parents' story didn't match the evidence. The CPS investigator, a sharp woman named Mrs. Chen, saw through their lies immediately. Your daughter has a detailed written account of the abandonment, created the night it happened, she told my parents in a meeting I wasn't present for, but heard about later. She has witness testimony. She has physical evidence. Your story doesn't align with any of the facts. So I'm going to ask you one more time. Did you abandon your daughter at that rest area? My parents stuck to their story. They had to. Admitting the truth meant admitting to a crime. So they lied, and they kept lying, and they hired lawyers to fight the charges. And I made another decision. I wasn't going back to them. Ever. Even if the charges were dropped, even if they won their case, I would never live with them again. I'd rather stay in foster care forever than go back to people who could throw me away so easily. Mrs. Chen helped me file for emancipation. At 16, it was difficult but not impossible, especially given the circumstances. I had to prove I could support myself financially, that I had a safe place to live, that emancipation was in my best interest. The foster family I was staying with agreed to let me remain with them while I worked toward emancipation. I got a part-time job at a bookstore. I kept going to school, brought my grades back up. I saved every penny I earned. And I kept writing. I documented everything that happened after the abandonment. Every meeting with CPS, every court date, every interaction with my parents' lawyers. I wrote about the foster home, about my job, about rebuilding my life from nothing. The notebook I'd bought at the rest area filled up, so I bought another one, and then another. Writing became my therapy, my purpose, my way of processing everything that had happened. The legal case against my parents dragged on for months. Their lawyers argued that it was a misunderstanding, that I was a rebellious teen making false accusations. But the evidence was too strong. The abandonment was real, documented, witnessed. Eventually, they accepted a plea deal. They pled guilty to child endangerment and neglect in exchange for probation and mandatory parenting classes. No jail time, but a permanent mark on their record. It felt like a slap on the wrist for what they'd done, but at least it was something. At least there was official acknowledgement that they'd committed a crime. My emancipation was granted 3 months before my 17th birthday. I was legally an adult, responsible for myself, free from my parents forever. It should have felt like a victory, but mostly it just felt lonely. I graduated high school a year later, working full-time and going to school full-time. I'd saved enough money to rent a tiny studio apartment. I applied to colleges and got accepted to several, but I couldn't afford to go. Instead, I kept working, kept saving, kept writing. I started a blog about my experience, writing anonymously about child abandonment, about surviving the system, about rebuilding your life after trauma. The blog gained followers slowly but steadily. People connected with my story. Other abandoned kids, other foster youth, other people who'd been thrown away by their families. I wrote about the practical aspects of survival, how to find resources, how to navigate social services, how to emancipate yourself. But I also wrote about the emotional aspects, the grief and anger and loneliness that came with being abandoned. The blog led to freelance writing opportunities. I wrote articles for websites and magazines about foster care, about youth homelessness, about family trauma. I got better at writing, more skilled, more professional. By the time I was 20, I was making enough from freelance writing to support myself without the bookstore job. I decided to pursue journalism seriously. I took online courses, built a portfolio, pitched stories to bigger publications. I specialized in investigative journalism focused on family issues, child welfare, systemic failures that hurt vulnerable kids. I was good at it. Really good. Because I'd lived it, I understood it in a way that other journalists didn't. I knew how to talk to sources, how to earn trust, how to tell stories that mattered. By 23, I was writing for major national publications. By 25, I'd won my first journalism award for an investigative series on failures in the foster care system. And by 28, I was ready to tell my own story. Not anonymously on a blog, but publicly, with my real name, with full documentation, with all the evidence I'd been collecting for 12 years. I decided to create a documentary. Not just an article or a blog post, but a full multimedia project that would tell the complete story of my abandonment and survival. I'd kept everything. The original notebook from the rest area, now carefully preserved. Every subsequent notebook I'd filled. Every court document, every CPS report, every piece of evidence from the case against my parents. Photos, recordings, interviews with people who'd helped me. I had 12 years of documentation, and I was going to use all of it. I hired a small production team, people I trusted, and we spent 6 months creating the documentary. We filmed at the rest area where I'd been abandoned, standing at the exact spot where my parents had left me. We interviewed Bill, the truck driver who'd helped me, who remembered that morning vividly. We interviewed Mrs. Chen, the CPS investigator who'd fought for me. We included court documents, audio recordings of proceedings, everything that was legally available. And we included my notebooks. Page after page of handwritten documentation, starting with that first entry at 3 in the morning in the rain. The documentary was called $5 and the Truth, a story of abandonment and survival. We released it on YouTube and on a dedicated website. I promoted it through my journalism contacts and my blog followers. And it went viral. Within a week, it had been viewed over 5 million times. Within a month, over 20 million. News outlets picked up the story. I was invited to do interviews on major networks. The documentary was being discussed everywhere, on social media, in think pieces, in conversations about parental rights and child welfare. And my parents saw it. Of course they saw it. Everyone they knew saw it. Their friends, their clients, their family. Everyone in their community suddenly knew exactly what they'd done. The documentary included their names, their photos, the court records of their conviction. Everything was public record, so it was all legal. But it destroyed them. My father's accounting business collapsed. Clients left in droves once they knew he'd abandoned his teenage daughter at a rest area. Who wants to trust their finances to someone capable of that? My mother worked as an office manager, and she was quietly let go from her job. The company didn't want the association, the negative publicity. They became pariahs in their community. People they'd known for years stopped talking to them. They were disinvited from social events. They were whispered about, pointed at, judged. Everything they'd cared about, their reputation, their standing in the community, their image as respectable people, it all crumbled. And it was all because of the truth. The truth I documented starting that night in the rain. The truth they'd tried to cover up and deny. The truth that finally, after 12 years, was being heard by millions of people. They tried to respond. They gave interviews claiming the documentary was biased, that I was exaggerating, that they'd made a mistake but didn't deserve this level of public shaming. But no one believed them. The evidence was too thorough. The documentation was too detailed. The court records were public. They'd been convicted of child endangerment. There was no denying what they'd done. The documentary also sparked a larger conversation about child abandonment and parental accountability. Lawmakers in several states introduced bills to strengthen penalties for child abandonment. Child welfare organizations used the documentary in training and advocacy. I was invited to speak at conferences, to consult on policy, to help other survivors tell their stories. The success of the documentary led to a book deal. I spent the next year writing a memoir, expanding on the documentary, going deeper into the emotional and psychological aspects of abandonment and survival. The book, also called $5 and the Truth, was published when I was 29. It became a bestseller. I went on a book tour, speaking to audiences around the country. I met hundreds of people who'd experienced similar trauma, who'd been abandoned or neglected or thrown away by their families. I heard their stories, and I shared mine, and together we created a community of survivors who refused to be silent. The book tour brought me to Nashville, and I decided to do something I'd been avoiding for years. I went back to the rest area. It was a sunny afternoon in May, nothing like that rainy October night 12 years earlier. The rest area looked smaller than I remembered, less frightening in the daylight. I walked to the spot where I'd sat on that concrete bench, where I'd bought the notebook, where I'd started writing. I stood there for a long time, remembering that scared 16-year-old girl, remembering how alone she'd felt, remembering the decision she'd made to document everything. And I felt grateful to her. Grateful that she'd been strong enough to survive. Grateful that she'd been smart enough to write it all down. Grateful that she'd refused to let the story be buried or forgotten. That girl had saved herself. And in doing so, she'd eventually saved others too. While I was standing there, a woman approached me. She was in her 30s, looked nervous. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Harper? The journalist who made the documentary?" I nodded. "I am." "I just wanted to thank you," she said, and her eyes filled with tears. "I was abandoned by my parents when I was 15. Different circumstances, but the same result. I've carried shame about it my whole life, like it was somehow my fault. But your documentary, your book, they helped me understand that it wasn't my fault. That I wasn't alone. That I could talk about it. You gave me permission to tell my truth. So thank you." We talked for a while, this stranger and I, two people connected by the shared experience of abandonment. And I realized that this was why I'd told my story. Not for revenge, though the accountability my parents faced was satisfying. But for this. For connection. For healing. For helping other people feel less alone. My parents never apologized. Not publicly, not privately. They maintained that they'd been unfairly vilified, that I'd blown everything out of proportion, that they were the real victims. I didn't expect anything different. People who abandon their children aren't usually capable of genuine remorse. But I didn't need their apology. I didn't need their acknowledgement or their regret. I'd built a life without them, a good life, a meaningful life. I had work I was proud of, a community of people I'd helped, a platform to advocate for vulnerable children. I had everything I needed, and none of it came from them. About a year after the book was published, I received a letter from my grandmother, my father's mother. She was elderly now, in her 80s, and her handwriting was shaky. "Dear Harper," the letter began. "I've watched your documentary and read your book. I'm so sorry for what my son did to you. I'm sorry I didn't know, didn't help, didn't protect you. I was horrified to learn the truth about why you were failing school, about how they were exploiting you. And I was devastated to learn about the abandonment. No child deserves that. You deserved so much better. I want you to know that I'm proud of you. Proud of how you've survived and thrived. Proud of the work you're doing to help others. Proud of your courage in telling your story. You've become a remarkable woman, and I'm honored to be your grandmother, even if I failed you when you needed me. If you're ever willing, I would love to see you. I understand if you're not ready or if you never want to see any of us again. But my door is always open to you. With love and regret, Grandma Helen." I cried when I read that letter. It was the first time anyone from my biological family had acknowledged what had happened, had apologized, had expressed pride in who I'd become. I wrote back. We started corresponding, carefully at first, then more regularly. Eventually, I visited her. We had a long conversation about everything that had happened, about my parents, about the abandonment, about the years since. She didn't make excuses for my father. She didn't try to minimize what he'd done. She just listened and apologized and told me she loved me. It wasn't a full reconciliation with my biological family. My parents and I never spoke again. But having a connection with my grandmother, having one person from that family who acknowledged the truth and supported me, it meant something. It helped heal a small part of the wound. Today, I'm 32 years old. I'm still working as an investigative journalist, still focusing on child welfare and family issues. I've published 2 more books. I consult with lawmakers on child protection legislation. I run a non-profit that provides resources and support for abandoned and emancipated youth. And I still write in notebooks, though now I have a whole shelf of them, documenting my life, my work, my thoughts. The habit I started that night at the rest area never left me. Writing is still how I process the world, how I make sense of things, how I preserve truth. People often ask me if I've forgiven my parents. The answer is complicated. I don't carry active hatred for them anymore. The anger that sustained me in the early years has faded into something more like indifference. They're just people who made terrible choices, who hurt me deeply, who never took responsibility for what they did. I don't wish them harm, but I don't wish them well either. They're simply not part of my life, and I'm at peace with that. What I have instead of forgiveness is understanding. I understand that some people are incapable of the kind of love children need. I understand that some parents see their children as extensions of themselves, as tools to be used, rather than as individuals to be nurtured. I understand that my parents' decision to abandon me said everything about them and nothing about my worth. And I understand that the best response to being thrown away isn't to prove your worth to the people who couldn't see it. It's to build a life so meaningful that their rejection becomes irrelevant. Last month, I was invited to give a keynote speech at a national conference on child welfare. The audience was full of social workers, foster parents, advocates, policymakers, people who dedicate their lives to helping vulnerable children. I told my story again, as I've told it hundreds of times now. But I ended with something new. When I was 16 years old, I said, my parents left me at a rest area with $5 and nothing else. They thought they were teaching me a lesson. They thought they were punishing me for embarrassing them. They thought I would break, that I would come crawling back, apologizing and obedient. But they were wrong. Because that night, soaking wet and terrified and alone, I made a choice. I chose to document my truth. I chose to survive. I chose to believe that my story mattered, even when I had no evidence that anyone would ever hear it. I bought a notebook instead of food. I wrote instead of sleeping. I preserved the truth instead of letting it be buried. And that choice, that single decision in my darkest moment, changed everything. It gave me power when I had none. It gave me purpose when I felt worthless. It gave me a weapon when I was defenseless. The truth, documented and preserved, became the foundation of everything I've built since. So to every young person out there who's been abandoned, neglected, or thrown away, document your truth. Write it down. Save the evidence. Tell your story. Because your truth has power. Your story matters. And someday, when you're ready, that documentation might be exactly what you need to hold people accountable, to heal yourself, to help others who've experienced the same pain. You are not alone. You are not worthless. You are not defined by the people who failed to love you. You are defined by how you survive, how you rebuild, how you choose to use your pain to create something meaningful. My parents thought they were throwing me away that night. But what they actually did was set me free. Free to become someone stronger than they ever imagined. Free to tell a truth they wanted buried. Free to build a life that matters, that helps people, that makes a difference. That's the real ending to this story. Not revenge, though accountability felt good. Not reconciliation, though connection with my grandmother brought healing. The real ending is this. I survived. I thrived. I turned the worst night of my life into the catalyst for everything good that came after. And if I could do it with $5 and a notebook, imagine what you can do with your truth and your determination. Don't let anyone make you believe you're disposable. Don't let anyone convince you that your story doesn't matter. Don't let anyone silence you. Document your truth. Survive. Thrive. And when you're ready, use your story to light the way for others who are still in the darkness. That's how we heal. That's how we create change. That's how we transform pain into purpose. Thank you. The standing ovation lasted for 5 minutes. Afterward, dozens of people came up to me, many of them crying, sharing their own stories of abandonment and survival. A young woman, maybe 19, handed me a notebook. I bought this after watching your documentary, she said. I've been documenting my story, just like you did. Thank you for showing me that my truth matters. I hugged her, this stranger who felt like family, and I thought about that 16-year-old girl at the rest area, shivering in the rain, making the decision to write. She had no idea that her choice would ripple out like this, would inspire others, would create a movement of survivors refusing to be silent. But that's the power of truth. That's the power of documentation. That's the power of refusing to let your story be erased. My parents tried to throw me away. Instead, they gave me the greatest gift, though they never intended it. They gave me a story worth telling. They gave me a purpose worth pursuing. They gave me a life worth living. And 12 years later, standing in front of hundreds of people who dedicate their lives to protecting children, I realized something profound. I won. Not because I destroyed my parents' reputation, though that happened. Not because I became successful, though that happened too. I won because I survived with my humanity intact. I won because I used my pain to help others instead of letting it destroy me. I won because I chose truth over silence, documentation over denial, purpose over bitterness. I won because I'm happy. Genuinely, deeply happy. I have work I love, people I care about, a life full of meaning. And my parents, wherever they are, whatever they're doing, they have none of that. They have the consequences of their choices. They have the reputation they earned. They have the isolation they created. That's not my revenge. That's just justice. This is Harper, signing off. To the parents who abandoned me, thank you for showing me exactly who not to become. To the people who helped me survive, thank you for showing me what real family looks like. To the survivors reading this, your story matters. Your truth has power. Document it. Preserve it. And when you're ready, share it. The world needs to hear from people like us. The world needs to know that being thrown away doesn't mean you're garbage. It means the people who threw you away couldn't recognize your value. But you can. You can see your own worth. You can build your own life. You can create your own family. You can turn $5 and the truth into something extraordinary. I did it. You can too. Never stop writing your story. Never stop telling your truth. Never stop fighting for the life you deserve. That's how we win. That's how we heal. That's how we transform the worst moments of our lives into the foundation of something beautiful. And that's the real happy ending.